Well, thank you so much for joining us. Can you start by introducing yourself and what office you're running for?
So my name is Matthew McQueen. I'm currently a state legislator. I'm running for state land commissioner.
And, some people might not know that this race is happening. They might not know the candidates. Can you tell us a little bit about, who you are, how you got to this position, and why you're deciding to run right now?
So the state land office is an incredibly important agency in New Mexico, and a lot of people haven't heard of it. When we became a state, and actually before we became a state, so the land office is older than the state. The federal government gave us land and said, here, take this land and use this land to earn money for your public schools. And that's what they do. So the land office holds 9 million surface acres in trust for the people in New Mexico, 13 million subsurface. And they manage it for a multiplicity of purposes, including revenue. And they do a very good job at that. They earn over $2 billion a year, primarily from oil and gas, and that goes into the Land Grant Permanent Fund to fund our public schools, universities, and hospitals. By background, I'm a real property attorney. I've been an attorney for over 30 years, practicing the area of real property law, specializing in land conservation. I've been in the legislature for 12 years, and for the past 10 years, I've chaired the House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. So I think that's a really good background and a good fit for the land office.
And was there something specific about sort of the moment or the significance of the office right now that motivated you to run this year?
Well, sure. Our current commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, has done a very good job, and she is term limited. So she can't run again, so it was going to be an open seat. And I thought about what they do at the land office, and I thought about my background, and it seemed like that was a good fit.
Um, if you had to kind of name a state or national political figure that inspires you, who would those people be, so they can kind of attach a little bit of like where you're coming from politically?
Nationally, boy, we long for the days of President Obama, the worry-free, scandal-free, competent management days. It seems like a long time ago at this point. In the state, I'll say I was always a fan of Senator Jeff Bingaman, and sort of similar in the sense of quiet competence. Like, you didn't see Senator Bingaman seeking the limelight. He was just doing the job and doing a good job, and just keeping at it.
Can you identify like 3 to 4 major policy positions or priorities for your campaign?
Okay, so the biggest challenge of the land office is diversifying the revenue. They're taking in over $2 billion a year, in the neighborhood $2.5 billion. It's possible they'll hit 3 this year, and 97% of that money comes from oil and gas. So they have to diversify that revenue. We can do more renewable projects, wind, solar, geothermal, that on 9 million acres, you have lots of options there. You can do commercial projects on appropriate parcels. So the land office holdings are scattered across the state. They're not all in one big chunk. And they have parcels in existing communities where you can do commercial projects or even do housing projects like affordable housing and workforce housing on state trust land. And I think that would be a good way to diversify that revenue. Related to that, I would like to see the state land office essentially take equity positions in some of these projects. So we're not just auctioning off a piece of land or entering into a long-term lease. I would like to see the land office, have a carried interest or be sort of a silent partner to increase the revenue flow to our public schools. And I'd also like to take a look at reinvigorating sort of the land swap process. There have been some very successful land swaps, land exchanges in the past as a way of consolidating holdings and protecting more land because of the checkerboarded nature of our state. And they're time intensive and difficult to do, but that's something I'd like to take a look at too.
Can you explain a little bit more? Maybe like if you were explaining it to like a recent voter, a high school graduate, what exactly that land swap means and why that is important. I think people can understand, funding and distribution, but that's a kind of a little more complicated. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. I'll give you an example. When the Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument was created, there were state trust land in holdings within the National Monument. National Monument's a federal designation, so that land becomes conservation land. And if the land office their mission is to earn income from land. They're not going to earn a lot of money from that. And so as part of that process, the federal government was required to exchange land for the inholdings within the national monument for other lands, other BLM lands. And my understanding is they've identified lands near the Santa Teresa port of entry that could be swapped for given to the land office. And that way the conservation lands inside the national monument stay in conservation and they go to the federal government. And meanwhile, the land office gets commercially valuable land that they can earn money for education. And so that to me is win-win. Like you keep the conservation lands in conservation and you go back to earning money for our schools.
Why do you think that resonates with primary voters specifically? The things that you're advocating for?
Getting through the primary voters can be a challenge, partly because the land office is kind of quiet in the background. A lot of people don't think about it. And then when you say it's the land office, people think it might be like the Forest Service or like the Bureau of Land Management, or even like they purchase land for the state, which they don't do. It's a challenge getting that message through. And I always talk about education because that truly is the mission of the land office. And I think that's something that most people understand. I mean, I know I have kids in public schools, and public education is foundational to our democracy. I mean, it's critically important, and we're trying to fund it as best we can. And the land office plays a big role in that. And I think that's something that people understand.
Just kind of a bigger picture on your campaign and catching people up to where you're at right now. Who has endorsed your campaign so far, and why does that matter to you?
So I've gotten some great endorsements, and it matters a lot to me because these are endorsements coming from people and organizations that I didn't have a pre-existing relationship with, that, they're not endorsing me because I'm their friend or, some other relationship, including Jim Baca and Ray Powell, two former land commissioners who obviously care deeply about the office and understand how it works. They sat down with me, they asked me what my priorities were, and they both independently decided to endorse me. I've been endorsed by the Sierra Club, Animal Protection Voters New Mexico, the Jane Fonda Climate PAC, the Environmental Justice Caucus of the Democratic Party of New Mexico. I said Animal Protection Voters, OK Wingay Pueblo, and just recently AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And the workforce at the land office is not unionized, but I'm a big believer in labor.
What is your strategy right now for reaching as many potential voters as you can before June?
Yeah, so I am all over the place. I actually did another interview down in Albuquerque earlier today. I have an event tonight. I have an event almost every night. And then, we're raising money, and there will be advertising. And people probably don't like political advertising, but I feel like if I can sit down and talk to people, they can understand how important the land office is and why I'm a good fit. But I can't sit down and talk with enough people. So there's going to be 30-second TV ads, and there's going to be pre-roll on YouTube and Facebook and things like that. And we're raising money to pay for that.
And I think, that is one of those nuts and bolts aspects of a campaign that has become kind of controversial in some ways. People do get kind of irritated by seeing ads, but it's a functional part of how you get your message out there. How much of your the funds that you've raised would be considered PAC spending, and does PAC spending in campaigns matter to you?
So I raise money from different sources. I do accept PAC money. For example, the Jane Fonda Climate PAC is a PAC. I don't accept oil and gas money. And there's a lot of oil and gas money out there. The Environmental Justice Caucus asked the 3 Democratic candidates if we would take oil and gas money, and I was the only candidate that said definitively, no, I won't take that. So I do raise money where I can.
Especially on the Democratic side, there's been a lot changing over the last couple of years. What have you learned about the Democratic Party and the people who vote for Democrats, and how does that change what you're doing for this campaign cycle, for land commissioners specifically?
So I don't think it changes anything. I will say Democrats represent people and Republicans represent corporations. And it's as simple as that. I'm running against two Democrats in the primary. I hope I win. I clearly have the most experience. If I don't win, I hope one of them wins the general, because the Republican Party is completely beholden to the oil and gas industry, and I think it'd be a real mistake to put a Republican in a de facto regulatory position relating to the oil and gas industry.
Definitely the National Democratic Party is very unpopular. State Democratic Party, I think it's a little bit different because there's a different level of output. Do you feel like attachment to establishment democratic institutions or the party hinders you in any way with your campaign?
You know, the parties aren't what they once were. I think that's probably the result of Citizens United, that people used to give money to the parties. And now, I get calls from the Democratic Party, will you sponsor a table? Like, they're basically fundraising from me. So I appreciate the Democratic Party. They're not in a position to help my campaign much. They certainly can't be involved in a contested primary anyway. And I think a lot of the dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party nationally is the lack of boldness. That it's not that, the Democratic Party opinion is very low. Donald Trump's opinion is very low. Opinion of Donald Trump is very low. It's different though. They want Donald Trump to do less stupid things. They want the Democratic Party to do more good things, and not just be anti-Trump. Although defending democracy is really important, but what do you stand for? Like, will you impose an ethics rule on the Supreme Court? Will you take bold action to support people and workers? Will you hold people who in the current administration are committing crimes and enriching themselves? Will you hold them accountable, as you should? So that's what I think the people want from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation, and clearly you talk with a lot of voters and people all the time, so it's really interesting to hear that perspective. Just again, you referenced it before actually, but your predecessor, Stephanie Garcia Richard, has kind of, I feel like, changed people's perspectives on the land commissioner office. Can you speak to, how do you feel about her legacy, what she's done in her tenure?
She's been tremendously successful. I served with Stephanie in the State House. She was in the State House before she got elected land commissioner. And I worked with her as land commissioner on the royalty rate bill. So the land office had wanted to raise the royalty rate in the Permian Basin from 20 to 25%, which is a better approximation of fair market value. And I actually got that bill through the legislature on my second try, and we got that up to the governor to sign. So in working with her, I worked with her and her staff, and that was a great experience. Her advice to me in that process was be bold. And I appreciate that. I think she has been bold, and I would certainly follow in those footsteps if I can.
Just on that line of boldness, being having some ideas that people are excited to vote for, and maybe instead of voting against something, right? Do you feel like you're meeting that moment? Do you feel like you're bold enough to reach that primary voter?
I do. I have not only do I have experience and background for this office, I actually have a proven track record in the legislature. There was the royalty rate bill. That was a huge deal. I got a bill passed to restore the ability of OCD, the Oil Conservation Division, to levy fines and penalties on the oil and gas industry, because they had lost that ability due to a court case, and I got that restored. I worked to protect the Gila River. I worked to block the importation and storage of high-level nuclear waste into New Mexico. We reformed the Department of Game and Fish into a modern Department of Wildlife. I worked to ban trapping on public land. I mean, these are all these natural resource issues that have always been near and dear to my heart, and that's what I did in the legislature, and I will take that with me to the land office.
We've kind of talked about your opponents in this primary race. What would you say differentiates you besides your experience on as a candidate?
We've done a couple panels together, and we agree on most things, right? And we all say we will protect public lands, and I think that's true. So I go back to experience, and it's not just the the amount of experience I have, but the quality of that experience. I have land, law, and legislative experience that neither of them really can touch. And it's all important. So like the legal experience, understanding how land works from a legal perspective, I think is really important. And the land office, even though it's independent, it still relies on the legislature for its budget, and it relies on the legislature if it needs any change in law. And I'm the only one of the three of us that has that experience.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start asking some questions that were submitted to us from our audience. So let me just pull those up so I can make sure that I'm saying it exactly how we were asked it. So yeah, and this is something that we're asking all the candidates. What is your position on the potential acquisition of P&M by Blackstone?
Yeah, so I'm concerned. I don't know of a good example where private equity has done something good for the community. I'm definitely concerned of the buy, strip, and flip mentality and approach that they have taken in other sectors. I would like to see P&M managed in a sustainable way that benefits the ratepayers and citizens of New Mexico, and I don't have confidence that a giant private equity firm is going to do that. So I'm closely watching what's going on at the PRC. Of course, there's this $400 million investment, which seems pretty shady. And then, once they get past that, if they get past that, there's the acquisition. I personally would like to see the State Investment Council look at whether or not P&M is a good investment for the state of New Mexico. And I think it is. Public utilities get a 10% rate of return. That would be a way of not only investing our permanent funds in something that gives a healthy return, but also protecting New Mexico and New Mexicans.
You mentioned something that I just feel like might need some clarification. Buy, strip, and flip was the phrase that you used. What does that mean?
So purchase an asset, strip out the valuable parts, cut costs, don't invest in it, and then sell it to someone else.
And that would be severely impactful for P&M and New Mexico ratepayers. Why?
P&M is it's a regulated public utility. It has monopoly service areas. It's something that requires constant, steady investment in order to improve the grid and serve its customers, and we don't want to see those services cut.
Do you support upholding your predecessor's decision to reject pipelines for Project Jupiter, which is a massive data center in southern New Mexico?
I do. I think Stephanie's done a great job. She's had a number of executive orders. That was not an executive order, but that was a decision in the land office. I don't intend to come in and change any of the decisions that she's already made.
Do you have a strategy for holding oil and gas companies accountable? For example, the orphaned well situation in the Permian Basin.
So my message to the oil and gas industry has been the same as my message to my conservation allies. And that is the oil and gas development will continue. Those parcels are already leased out, and there are still some parcels left to be leased out. What we can do, though, is hold the oil and gas industry accountable. So we expect them to pay a fair price. That's why we raised the royalty rate. We expect them to follow the rules, to abide by the emission standards. We expect them to clean up their own messes, and we expect them to have enough bonding or other assurance in place that when there is a downturn or when the company does go out of business, that it's the company or the industry that's paying to cap and plug those wells, not the taxpayer.
Do you feel like the stakes have changed for renewable energy in New Mexico, and what sort of policy incentives would encourage that transition from oil and gas towards renewables, kind of that diversification we talked about?
The renewables are coming. I think I think transition has always been the right word for our energy picture, and I personally believe that transition is primarily economic, not political. The renewables are going to outcompete oil and gas, and we want to be positioned to take advantage of that. So we're currently an energy producing state, primarily through oil and gas, but we have abundant sun and wind and geothermal resources, and we can capitalize on that, and we should.
New Mexico has unique flora and fauna, but we're also facing impacts from climate change. What would the balance that you would strike between land conservation policies and development?
There are certainly some parcels that should not be developed. Absolutely. Natural areas, outdoor recreation areas, hunting and fishing access, these are things that are important to New Mexico. I think it was 2 days ago, the Land Office and the New Mexico Land Conservancy announced a conservation lease where the Conservancy, through I believe it's the Department of Defense, leased 60,000 acres of state trust land for conservation purposes. And this is pursuant to a federal program where they need offsets. And having the state trust land, the natural resources on the state trust land protected as an offset is a great way not only to protect that asset, but also to still earn income from that property as they're mandated to do.
This last one is kind of just more of a fun one. But what do you think is the most underrated state park?
So when I got married later in life, and we were going to go on a honeymoon, and we couldn't go because we were old people, but we wanted to have kids and we couldn't wait, and we were successful. And we ended up going down to Silver City for a week, and we went out to the City of Rocks State Park. And that place is so cool. It's just like these giant boulders, and you can walk around and you can climb on some of the boulders, and City of Rocks State Park, that's my favorite.
All right. Anything else that you think potential voters might need to know about who you are, what you stand for, your campaign?
So this to me is public service. I've been in the legislature for 12 years. As you know, the legislature is, at least for now, still unpaid. And I did that because I believe in public service. And moving to the land office is just a natural evolution for me based on my background and my focus. Just continued public service for the state of New Mexico. And I think I'll be good at it.
No, maybe to help folks connect with you, if they really liked what they heard, how can they help contribute to your campaign, or where are you at in your campaign? How can people help?
So we're definitely raising money, and I always appreciate that. I have a great website. It's McQueen4NM.com, McQueen FORNM, or you could just search Matthew McQueen. And there's a lot about me and what I've done, and there's a contribute button on the website.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.